Okay, let me welcome you all again. We have got the series of talks on the Workers' International. This is going to be an ongoing theme, and the first one of which is Marx and the First International as part one, is what Ed is going to introduce today. I don't think there is much I can add, apart from already what you've all seen as the introduction to the talk of today. But let me just re-stress on the point that was mentioned there as well, and that is a series of questions with regard to the changes, in regard to the background. It changes from the point of view of how the International managed to bring together so many different approaches, at least, let's say, and draw lessons from it, and what are the issues which are being faced at the moment. So without any further ado, let me ask Ed Bober to start. Ed, would you like to start? And would you like me to give you a reminder after about 20 minutes or so?
Well, yeah, give me a reminder after 10 minutes and every subsequent 5 minutes or so. Sure. But Aman, and I'm addressing all the comrades at this meeting today. This is slightly different. I'm starting this meeting in a different way from the tradition that the speaker gives an introduction. My very first point in this meeting is a question which I would like, if possible, for each comrade on this Zoom call to make one or two sentences in the form of an answer to this question. And it seems counterintuitive to start a talk about an international that is from the 19th century with this question. But this question is, what are the aims of Win? What is Win trying to do now? And I would like to just simply go round the room and ask. I mean, I'll give everybody a minute to think about it, maybe jot down a note or two, and then I'll go around the room and simply ask everyone to say one or two sentences on that. And we'll come back in the course of what I subsequently say about the First International. We'll make reference to what comrades, or hopefully we'll make connections with what comrades are going to say. So I'll just give everyone a minute or two to think about that question, and then I'll start again. Okay, jot down a few notes if you want to. If you're not clear, the question is, what is Win trying to do? Okay, have comrades had enough time to just get a few? I'm not talking about a major speech. I'm talking about a few ideas. Have comrades had enough time? Do you want a little more, or shall we go into it now?
Would you like me to start?
Yeah. Okay. Aman, go yeah. Just go round the room, Aman, and, sure, and call comrades to just say a sentence or two.
Sure. I personally thought that Win is there as a forum for exchange of ideas, getting to know exactly what are the lessons learned and the situation in different places, and therefore be able to learn from each other. That's what I understood Win to be.
Okay.
Okay, shall I go through the hands as they come up?
Yeah, go through the hands. Yeah.
Hi, comrades. I think what we're trying to do is to evaluate the current situation and apply Marxist theory to it. Thank you.
Thanks. who would like to go next, or shall I just read the names? Larry?
Yeah, thank you, Roman. My understanding of the objectives, if you want, for WIN, is to build a grassroots international platform to bring ideas of a different dimension than what might be termed as shop floor discussion. And my understanding, and one of the things I'd like Rob to elaborate on, is why does he think that the reason for joining this sort of group and what the objective is to bring forward questions that could be understood and asked at a certain level of debate. And that is that with one of the people you mentioned was the revolutionary anarchism. Why is that not part and parcel of the internationals as they progress? If you consider the internationals as progressing, why it's not caught on when it's something that I've always tried to understand. Anarcho-syndicalism, it seems to have such favour with me, but that fails to have an agenda or an appeal within the socialist movement of today. I don't know whether that answers your question.
It's a great contribution to answering the question, Larry. Thank you. Keep going, Aman, if you want to go around the room. Yeah.
David Hampson.
Okay. There always too many Davids around, Aman. I keep getting embarrassed. Well, look, 3 points. First of all, in my view, and this is somewhat personal, to rebuild what we once had. You know, we really had some marvelous links and development, support from a center to, let's call it the periphery, marvelous practical support. Secondly, to develop practical solidarity and strike action as the workers' movement builds itself and rebuilds itself, and to be a functioning trade union for revolutionaries. So if you end up in the KGB cells, you know, someone is outside there fighting for you. And thirdly, to rebuilding and developing theory, the theory of Marxism, not by repeating old formulas or standard formulas, and although that's not entirely unuseful, but to develop a scientific method, using a scientific method to theorize from the data that we see around us. We've got an immense amount of data accessible to us, and to theorize, and so we actually are building a scientific base for our theory.
Thank you, David. Rolf?
Yes, I do like the last point, that we are a union for socialists or Marxists. What I think WIN is, well, it's a way to bring Marxist theory into the labor movements, and it is definitely needed. What we see in Denmark, we see that Marxist theory is very popular in university. We see an increasing interest, but not in the labor movements, not in the unions, and not in the social democracy or the left socialist parties in Denmark. But I see this organization as a possibility to, of course, to deal ideas and to share what is going on in all the countries who is in the win. That's what I would say about it.
Thank you. Finn?
Comrades, I think that question is very relevant, particularly with regard to Ed's contribution, or forthcoming contribution. I mean, of the various internationals, the one that we should be closest to is actually the First International. Because when the First International was initiated, it was workers in struggle that brought it together, such as the London Trades Council, for example, and the struggle for independence in Poland and such things as that nature. So what we should be trying to do is to connect with workers in struggle and with the real living organizations, not with individuals, but with the living organizations of the workers engaged in struggle. Now, there's going to be difficulties, as there were in the First International, with the anarchists and the destructive moves and eventually the collapse of International and its movement to New York and all that. But we don't need to focus on that. When the First International began, that's the thing to work on. It was living organizations of the class who didn't have to agree on policy or tactics or strategy, just to agree that they were in common endeavor to fight against the capitalist system and the colonial system, and then to bring into the organization workers in struggle, and particularly their organizations. And I think that's what WIN's objective should be, to attract into our orbit workers who are engaged in day-to-day struggles against capitalism through their organizations. And there'll be differences, of course there'll be differences, but we shouldn't focus on that. Once the workers are engaged in struggle and they engage with us, that's a huge step forward. And I would see, just getting back to the initial point, the First International, which Ed is going to talk about shortly, is the organization closest to what I think we should be endeavoring to achieve in WIN, i.e. a forum for workers in struggle and their living real organizations that they use as part of their struggle.
Thanks, Finn. I can't see any more raised hand, Ed.
Oh, here we are. Bob's waving his hand, I think, or is he just waving a pen?
Bob, you're on mute. We don't know whether you're agreeing or whether you want to talk.
I can't hear you, Bob.
We still can't hear you, Bob.
You're muted, you're muted. Still can't hear you. I can't hear you, Bob. I can't hear you, Bob.
Well, while Bob is trying to unmute himself, shall I go to Roger?
Go to Roger and we'll come back to you, Bob, yeah.
Okay, but I think Bob is still trying to say something.
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah, I found the right button, sorry. Yeah, thanks. I very much welcome everything that comrades have said. To try and put it together as tersely as possible, I think we would like to create, or perhaps just prepare the groundwork for, the place where the world's working class can think, debate, organize, and train their own leadership for the workers' revolution that can abolish capitalism. I think in doing this, we need to learn and rescue what was learned from past struggles. I think that it's essential to have a real study of socialist theory, and to struggle for socialist theory against the bourgeois methods of thinking that inevitably attack it in the society we live in, and to fight for Marxist theory in the working class and in the real organization of workers' struggle, as comrades have said. Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Roger, I think you're the only one left with the hands up.
Okay, well, I think we have to start from the situation we are in. There has never been a period like this of worldwide struggle. on every continent, the latest example of which, or if you like, the latest promise of which we saw yesterday reaching Britain with the TUC demo, which is, I think, at the beginning of a whole new era of struggle, such as we probably haven't seen in our lifetimes. Now, with all these struggles, at the same time, there is no link, there is no common program. They're all separate and completely isolated struggles with very little reference to any other movement or anything more than the basic kind of tenets of solidarity. And in that situation, I think Finn put it best. We're in the same kind of situation as Marx and Engels were in the 19th century. I don't want to preempt what Ed is going to go into in more detail. But the point is that what was needed then was not to develop necessarily, well, of course, to develop the theory, but at the same time, it was at all costs to build an organization, to build a movement which would link all those struggles together. And as we'll see when we go into the history of the First International, most of the elements in the International at the time of its foundation didn't even consider themselves to be socialists. But the point was that they were workers' struggles and they needed to be coordinated together. We still need to do that now. In that sense, it's a little different from the tasks facing Lenin when he built the Third International, and Trotsky when he attempted or took the first steps in putting the basis for a Fourth International, in the sense that in their day, there were already mass organizations, and what their task was to create a worthy leadership of those organizations and a clear theory. As far as we're concerned now, theory is very important and leadership is very important, but above all, to unify the struggle so that there's a common forum in which the theoretical ideas can then be argued out between workers engaged in their struggles and learning from one another's struggles. So I would say it's, well, I think that sums up what Win is trying to do.
Okay, is there anyone else who wants to say a few words on this question?
No one has got their hands up.
Okay, well, comrades, thank you for those contributions. I mean, that's great. And, you know, I think comrades can already see where this is going, that we're starting with a very old piece of history, but we're also starting with some practical questions that face ourselves today. I mean, prior to the First International, there were a few elementary attempts to bring together the working class movement internationally, like the Communist League, which Marx and Engels participated in. Actually, I mean, it even led to the publication of the now world famous Communist Manifesto. But these were sort of, you know, these were the first steps towards what happened with Marx and Engels being involved from the very beginning in the formation of the First International in 1864. And there'd been a huge development of industry in Britain, with you know, massive industrialization and workers, peasants being drawn off the land into factories and so on. And despite the huge development of productive forces, no improvement in the living standards of the working class. The 10-hour bill had been passed in 1847, restricting the hours of women and children at work, but it still hadn't made any difference to the actual living standards that working class people were subjected to. The cooperative movement, associated with the work of Robert Owen in Britain, had demonstrated prior to the existence of the First International, the cooperative movement had demonstrated that factories don't have to be controlled by an elite class dominating over those who work in them, that they can be run collectively by those who do the work. But the limitations of Robert Owen's movement was that it was, despite a few isolated cases where there could be some sort of collectivization of labor within the factory, the collectivization of management within the factory, that could not, without a massive struggle against the power of the capitalist class, that couldn't be extended from one or two factories to apply to the whole of society. You had at the same time, you had these sort of international issues that affected the working class, that the working class took an interest in. First of all, on many occasions when there was strikes in Britain, scab labour was imported from France. So the working class of Britain began straight away to get a sense of the need for the development of some kind of international solidarity, some kind of communication with French workers. You had a movement of the British workers in support of the struggle against slavery in the United States, which actually upended, it prevented the British ruling class from being able to push their policy of support for the slave owners in the South. So there were, already this very different working class from the working class we know today. It was very new in human history. It was, just cutting its teeth on the first sort of steps in class struggle, but it straight away came onto the international scene with progressive policies and actually preventing the reactionary policies of its own ruling class. So you see the dimension of internationalism developing straight away with the emergence of the working class. Equally important was working class sympathy in Britain and the rest of Europe as it developed for the Polish uprising against Russian imperialism in 1863. So, this was a fight for a working class foreign policy, as well as basic working class principles such as preventing scab labour. These were the kind of ideas that led to a meeting in St. Martin's Hall in London on the 28th of September 1864, where the First International was founded. I think comrades have made the point about why it was founded. It was bringing together workers' organisations to promote their general interests, to combine and generalise the movement of workers, but not to dictate or impose any doctrinaire system over the working class. It was intended to be a medium of communication between workers of different countries. It was to protect their rights that are such as they had and advance and increase the rights of the working class. It formed a central council so that workers in each country could be kept informed about the movement in other countries. It built connections between different workers' struggles. It generalized the hitherto disconnected efforts of the working class in each country. It developed international inquiry and research into the conditions of the working class, such as the length of the working day, wages, the treatment of workers, the impact of employment, the amount of child labor, the physical condition of the workers, the education of workers. In fact, it's very, very interesting that the comments of Marx and Engels on the need for the education of workers, actually showing an outline, a more progressive approach to education, even than exists in education management in Britain today. I mean, for example, the idea that there should be no distinction between intellectual education and practical education. The idea that education should be connected with work and employment, as well as personal and intellectual development. All of those ideas in embryo exist in the comments of Marx and Engels about the need for education for working class children in the middle of the 19th century. There was a membership fee of a halfpenny per member per year. Perhaps Wynne can do a little bit better than that. They campaigned for an 8-hour day, but particularly with an emphasis on limiting child labour. Now, comrades have already made the point that this was very unlike the Second International, which was founded on Marxist principles from the beginning, and unlike the Third International, which was founded on very strict criteria, deliberately excluding reformists. The First International was open to all political currents within the working class. And that reflected the needs of the movement at the time, the importance of bringing all workers in struggle together, including those workers who hadn't yet developed fully worked out socialist ideas. So you had the cooperative movement of Robert Owen. You had Proudhon with the idea of mutual ownership, which would eventually expand and replace capitalism. So according to Proudhon, there was no need for class struggle. Eventually, with the success and popularity of mutualism, capitalism would be done away with. Marx and Engels, they didn't turn their backs on these ideas. They worked with these other movements because they recognized that this was part of the mix of discussion that was required in order to cultivate the conditions for a working class movement that knew where it was going and what it was doing. You had the idea of Blanqui, that the revolution should be carried out by a secret band of conspirators who would then do away with the bourgeoisie and somehow hand power to the working class on a plate. And then you had the idea of Bakunin, who agreed with Marx and Engels that capitalism had to be overthrown, but he accused Marx and Engels of policies that would lead to the creation of a new form of authoritarianism, as bad as the existing ruling class. But Bakunin hadn't grasped the point that Marx and Engels envisaged the creation of a worker state as part of the transformation of productive forces, the transformation of society, to raise society from a level which was commensurate with capitalism, where you had to have rulers, to productive forces where it was possible for the working day to be so short that every member of the working class could participate in the running of society. And this idea that you have a worker state to begin with, a kind of semi-state, whilst the collectivization and the planning of the economy allowed productive forces to be pushed much further ahead, it was an idea which recognized that you can't just jump from capitalist production to a classless society, which somehow in Bakunin's approach, but Bakunin's approach was that you would have a kind of an anarchist revolution led by an elite band. And once they'd taken power, they would miraculously hand power over to the mass of the population with no transitional step, no no opportunity to reorganize the economy in a planned way, no opportunity to move from a state of capitalism to a state where society is ready for communism. And Bakunin and his anarchists were really a huge part of the complication of the First International towards the end of its active life. Bakunin was perhaps the most controversial of the several controversial figures who Marx engaged with. Marx, at many stages in the development of this international, collaborated quite closely with all these different characters and their movements and so on. And Bakunin really became larger than life towards the end of the International. And after the defeat of the Paris Commune, Marx and Engels recognized that there would be a new period probably of demoralization. And they really moved the seat of the International to the United States to avoid Bakunin being able to continue making all his crazy ideas dominate in the International. Throughout all these debates, Marx's principle was the International doesn't presume to dictate and hardly even to advise, but at every moment it accords its sympathy and its aid to the struggles of the working class. And the First International went into decline after 1871, but it left a heritage of ideas which clarified a lot of the tasks of the revolution. And these foundations were present at the outset when the Second International was formed. And this, perhaps, what I'm saying now, is in part the answer to Larry in the initial contributions that were made to this discussion. What was the reason why anarchism really never got a say in the second and the subsequent internationals? Because the foundations of Marxism had been laid by the work that had been done in the First International, and the working class movement had become, if you like, mature enough to understand when the Second International was created. And of course, this is touching now on the subject of the next discussion in this series. When the Second International was created, anarchism was not really a major or a significant current in the working class movement any longer. And I think probably at that point, it's time to hand back to the comrades, and we'll continue the discussion from there.
Yep. Are you happy to take contribution now, Ed?
I'm happy, but Aman is the chair, and he looks like, oh yeah, he's coming in now. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering to see when you would like to actually stop and then let other contributions to come in, or whether you would like to, like before.
It's time now. It's time now.
Okay. Larry, please go ahead then. I've got Larry's hand up.
Thank you, man. And I understand, Ed, and thank you very much for your contribution. The Bakunin, I do have sympathies there, in as much as that self-criticism of any organization has to be tolerable, and that's where the revolutionary anarchism comes from my point of view. But just coming back to your original question, where is win and what is its objectives? And one of the things I took note of was, while you were talking, was it's about building international networks. And the international network, as far as I was concerned, and some of the elements I've read with on the question of information between international workers was certainly during one book I read was War on the International by Sam Bernstein and Al Richardson, was the way that they had to build networks during the Second World War, and the networks have continued even today. Between workers. It doesn't have to be with an organization, but it has to be with the endorsement of workers. And I think this is the role that Workers' International Network can fulfill, is because we're finding struggles at all levels of industry, both at home and on an international scale. And Wynne, as far as I'm concerned, highlighted that aspect of the question of the trade unionists in Belarus, where we saw, and a lot of people are questioning the fact that are the independent trade unions in Belarus a CIA front, whereas I take a different perspective and say that, and I'll come back to Bakunin, in as much as you have to be self-critical of the state, and because the state can be all corrupted, and it falls on the shoulders of the working class to question the state at every level and at every turn. This is the element of, how can I say, accountability and openness within it. And that's where I support the transitional program route to republicanism and the working class being able to question those who purport to lead the working class, but at the same time distance themselves from the working class. So I'll leave it there, and see if Ed or any other comrades want to come back. Thank you, Amana.
Thank you, Larry. Would anybody else like to contribute before I ask Ed to come back in, or? Roger, you had said that you wanted a few minutes. Do you want to speak now?
I can speak now, but I thought it might be better if any other comrades want to come in first. I'll hold back, but otherwise, I'm ready when you are.
Sure. Let me ask you to go ahead, because I'm giving a few more to go around before Ed comes back on. Go on, Roger.
All right. Well, I think, sorry, just 1 second. I think we have to say first that what an incredible achievement it was of Marx and Engels to have completely changed the whole purpose and objectives and theoretical outlook and political structure and so on of the working class in the space of just 7 years intense activity. But when they helped to found the International, their objective was to unite all the disparate, nascent workers' organizations around the world, no matter how limited. And even outside the parameters of the working class, they strove to encompass all genuine movements of protest against the existing order, to unite all the existing embryonic organizations of resistance to capitalism into a single worldwide movement. And that would give them the framework within which to pit what they considered their scientific ideas against those of the assorted sectarians peddling their quack panaceas. Look at what Marx said. He said the International consisted of English Owenites and Chartists, French Proudhonists and Blanquists, Irish nationalists, Polish patriots, Italian Mazzinists, and German socialists. They're the only ones, he said, who were socialists. And what he meant by the German socialists was him, Engels, and a couple of other exiles. The English were against special privilege, he said, the French against Bonapartism, the Irish against Britain, the Poles against Russia, the Italians against Austria, and the Germans against capitalism. Again, the Germans were the only ones really who had were beginning to formulate a socialist outlook. And Engels said it was the aim of the International was to weld together into one huge army the whole militant working class of Europe and America. And therefore, he said, it could not set out from the principles laid down in the Communist Manifesto. It couldn't start with the crystal clear, sharp socialist theory, and it had to be on a very broad basis of being any genuine workers' movement against a protest against the existing order. And I don't, just to hammer home the point one more time, you know, it embraced English craft unions, French workers' cooperatives, scattered groups of German exiles, Italian nationalists, Russian bomb-throwing anarchists, and quite apart from all manner of charlatans, heretics and adventurers, the Proudhonists of France, Spain and Belgium, they were opposed, of France, Spain and Belgium were opposed on principle to strikes. The Italians of Germany, who actually refused persistent approaches to join the International, but they were actually secretly collaborating with the dictator Bismarck. Then there's Bakunin, and Ed has already dealt with that. And the British trade unionists were frankly terrified by all manifestations of what they called continental socialism. But nevertheless, at its core stood the working class, and above all at that time, the British working class, which showed again and again solidarity with the victims of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and on Napoleon III's coup in France, and with the Polish uprising against the Russian Tsar. And Abraham Lincoln himself praised the nobility of the Lancashire cotton workers who starved rather than break the blockade on the southern slave-owning cotton states during the American Civil War. And the International actually grew. This is something which I think will be a surprise to many people. It grew to a membership which has been estimated as anywhere between 5 to 8 million members. It was a huge mass organization by the time of its, by the end of its existence. And they organized in the only way they could, along the lines of the fraternal self-organization of workers anywhere, when not distorted by bureaucratic interference, in accord, generally speaking, with the principles of workers' democracy, free debate, united action, and so on. Of course, it wasn't free of human weaknesses. There was plenty of examples of along with heroism and solidarity and humor and comradeship, plenty of vanity, pomposity, opportunism, sectarianism, cowardice, adventurism, petty corruption, and so on, but no trace of any privileged officialdom hell-bent on systematic betrayal of the working class. That was to come later, when the time when the real mass organizations were created of the Second and Third International. And Marx and Engels, of course, were anything but sectarian. I think everybody knows the quotes from Communist Manifesto, even from the prehistory, if you like, that the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties, that what marked them out was, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class, and on the other hand, theoretically, they had the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march. In other words, they were the best organized, and they had the clearest perspectives. And of course, that wasn't quite the same as the task facing Lenin in 1921 or Trotsky in 1938. In their day, Marx and Engels had to pit their scientific socialist ideas against the pet remedies of a range of cheap charlatans and snake oil salesmen and so on. The quackery of Düring. Who's ever heard of Düring now, except with the prefix anti in front of it? That's the mark of the success of Engels in that case in countering those false ideas. The opportunism of Lassalle, the adventurism of Blanqui, the confused posturing of Bakunin, and so on. The workers' movement was many times put in peril by the cowardice, vanity, or treachery of such characters, and by honest mistakes, or even sometimes, yes, by personal crimes, but by nothing more sinister than that. they worked very differently according to the different situations they were in. In the Communist League prior to 1848, that was a small cadre organization, a clandestine organization, and the nature of their work was not at all the same as when the First International was created on the crest of a mass movement when all kinds of disparate ideas were being debated, from the trade unions in London to all the other tendencies that I mentioned. And again, as Engels said, it was necessary to be bold in matter, but mild in manner. They were very far from the kind of caricature of Marx and Engels as kind of dogmatic, dictatorial in their manner and so on. On the contrary, they worked really, and by the way, not as a secret organized faction, but as an open tendency within the First International. They just said that, well, this is our ideas, and we'll debate them with anybody. And in the course of those 7 years, as I said, they established a situation where their ideas gained predominance. And so the International was to become a kind of worldwide ideological workshop in which all the rival ideas could be tested out in practice against the experiences of the workers in victory and in defeat. And what was needed, and the same is needed now, above all, was a forum in which to debate the issues. Marx and Engels succeeded brilliantly and almost single-handedly. And that meant that when the Socialist International was founded in 1889, it brought together mass parties and mass trade unions and stood on the foundation of scientific socialist ideas. And in fact, its very first act, to preempt the next discussion, was to organize an international one-day general strike, an event which actually struck terror into the ruling class. So just to finish, the effectiveness of their work was proved by the fact that within those 7 short years, by the time it was forced to shut down, they had succeeded in winning all the surviving cadres, so that when the next international was founded, it was on the basis, at least nominally, of Marxist ideas. And that's a stunning tribute, as I said at the beginning, that they had already won the argument. It took the defeat of the Paris Commune, but their brilliant analysis of its lessons was written in the collective name of the General Council. And that's really the mark of how their the prestige, if you like, that their ideas had gained by the time. And although the International itself was dashed against the rocks of reaction, but once the tide had turned and the newly emergent mass parties and trade unions had established the International, the Second International, in 1889, it was under the banner of the ideas of the Communist Manifesto. Now, we're not Marx and Engels, so we don't claim to be, but the tasks facing socialists today are similar. We've largely a new working class, learning afresh the lessons of struggle. A new working class in the sense of productive manufacturing workers on new terrain in China and other virgin territory, if you like, and even in the West and in Britain, a largely new working class in the sense of a casualized working population who haven't grown up in the traditions of mass trade unionism, apart from a small public sector that still survives. Nevertheless, with enormous impetus, an enormous influence in society, as we will see in the near future, I think, in Britain. What would Marx and Engels do today? After all, their practice was really threefold. One, active participation in the established labour movement, in their case, the London Trades Council. Two, building links worldwide with anybody prepared to discuss, with anybody who had any kind of roots in the working class. By painfully laborious postal communication, we've got the huge advantage of modern technology, of the internet, of Zoom and the rest of it. But they had to use painfully laborious postal communication at the time, sometimes waiting weeks or months for answers to correspondence and so on. But they laboriously pursued those tasks because it was so important. And by the way, not just with people who were their allies, but they went out of their way to offer an olive branch and to open communications with people who violently disagreed with them and were going to be fighting against their ideas. And the third thing, of course, was through political education, in thorough research, in scientific study, in developing the theoretical foundations of Marxism, and on a very modest and minor and very, very pitifully small scale, but we're trying to follow their example today. And as in their day, but perhaps 1,000 times more so, there are worldwide struggles which are just bursting forth day after day. Right, thanks, colleagues.
Thank you, Roger. Anyone else would like to come back and contribute? Finn, please go ahead.
I just want to return to this issue of slavery in America. There's lots of new material being published now, and lots of new discussion about the dependence of British capitalism on the slave trade and how British capitalism relied for its profits on slavery in America. The cotton industry, tobacco industry, and so on, derived their profits from the existence of the slave system in America. So that's why the British were tempted to come in on the side of the slave owners. Incidentally, there was a minor engagement off the east coast of America between the British Navy and the Union forces early on in the Civil War, where the English were defeated and then they switched sides. But it wasn't just a matter of opportunism. It was a principled position that they adopted international, because in opposing slavery, they were weakening the capitalist system. As I said, there's lots of new material appearing now. We often get the impression that slavery is something to do, and the biggest states, the big slave-owning states in America, is something peculiarly American. With the English ruling class derived enormous profits from the slave industry. And I'm not talking about the importation and export of slaves through Bristol and Liverpool. I'm talking about the capitalist system of production relying for its profits on the existence of slavery in America. And maybe we need to engage a bit more in that question. Marx and Engels took a principled position on that issue. But if you bear in mind that a lot of industry in England, say around the cotton industry, Manchester, relied for their profits on slavery in America. So, I mean, I haven't read any of the old newspapers at the time, but I'm sure there was lots of propaganda saying, oh, Jesus, we can't take that position because all these jobs are going to be lost in the cotton industry right across England. But nonetheless, whatever the arguments were, Marx and the International took a principled position. Something else I want to look at is the International supported the release of the Fenian political prisoners being held in British jails. Now, the Fenians, some of them were in prison for having committed, English people were killed in Clerkenwell in an attempt to escape from prison. Some ordinary civilians were killed. So it wouldn't have been a very popular necessarily demand at the time. Nonetheless, Marx and Engels took it up in International. But the reasons they put forward for their support weren't sentimental. Marx argued that Irish independence would weaken landlordism in Ireland by the new independent state restoring the land to the people who worked it, and the English landlords would have suffered as a consequence. Also, the policy of cheap food would have been undermined if Irish independence had been accepted, and Marx suggested that import tariffs could be imposed, and this would then weaken the cheap food policy in Britain. Similarly, these are arguments that Marx put forward, concrete arguments. So it wasn't about sentiment and independence and nationalism. It was about concrete arguments against British occupation in Ireland. The export of Irish labour from Irish peasant landholdings in Ireland created a huge pool of cheap labour in the British capitalist market. And Irish independence would prevent that process and would lessen the possibility of English capitalists being able to exploit cheap labour, leaving the peasant farms in the west of Ireland. Another argument he put was the division between Irish and English labourers in England would also be weakened by the establishment of Irish independence. So when they took up that question of release of Fenian prisoners, it wasn't about sentiment or was some kind of a, well, sentimental adherence to nationalism. It was a concrete issue with regard to weakening capitalism in England. And it's important to realize that, but something maybe we could look at in a bit more depth. It isn't often discussed, but I agree with all the comrades' points about the role of Bakunin and others, particularly Bakunin, in the international, and eventually the international folded because of the antics of Bakunin and the necessity to move to New York. But anarchism had a big hold in France, in Spain, in Italy, for very specific reasons. And it survived. I mean, the Spanish anarchists survived into the Spanish Civil War. Okay, they played a very bad role in undermining the Republican government at the time. But nonetheless, anarchism survived also in France. So France, Spain, Italy. And we need to maybe look at that. Where did that influence come from? And their influence wasn't just a bunch of middle-class bomb throwers. They were very influential in the organized labor movement in these countries. Now, I don't have a position on it, but I'd like to hear a bit more, maybe examination as to why anarchism took hold in these countries, but not, for instance, in England, Germany, and other countries. That's it.
Thank you, Finn. Any other comrade would like to come in?
Mine?
Yeah, please go on, David.
Okay. Well, look, I think it's a very good discussion, and thanks, Ed, for introducing a new method of addressing an issue, you know, rather than just giving good ideas. No doubt they would have come in that order, but you know, it's a real exchange, and it's clarifying quite a few things. Can we say right from the beginning that you know, the First International was built on what was available. That was what various radical movements tried to change society in different ways with all kinds of ideas, you know, was information. And that, in a sense, is what we're having on a much larger scale in our present mode. As Roger's explained, we're seeing huge movements developing. And but what we find, and I'll refer a bit to South Africa, is that these movements are rising and counter-revolution is rising at the same time. So we're seeing strikes, and we're also seeing foreigners being beaten to death and people taking pictures of this as selfies to show that they're there at that murder. You know, it's kind of a joke situation. So it's a very dangerous situation. We have very powerful forces, you know, unfolding, and each of these forces, each of these movements is a challenge to us. But look, and why it's a challenge is because we have to have a set of ideas, and we have to have a set of methods so that we can help build, in the most emergency situation, with the greatest rapidity, a new, fresh leadership, which actually has no connection to the experiences we've personally and other people may have had in the 1970s and 80s. There's no idea of that. There are many different ideas, and we have to somehow engage in debate and unify those different movements and guide them towards a socialist outcome, which is a huge task. It's an immense task because we're starting from very little, you know, indeed. Now, I just want to touch on this question which was raised about independent unions and independent movements. You see, what we're seeing now is the rise of independent movements. And unlike, let's say, the Second International and at that time, there are all kinds of new ideas, you know, circulating among young people, among young workers, and you know, who don't start with books and set theories. And an independent movement of the working class poses an immense challenge, not only to us, but for our reasons, but also to nationalists, to all kinds of bourgeois politicians If I could just explain in relation to South Africa, we had a brilliant strike movement in 1973. That's 50 years ago. But we actually had zero support or understanding of what was happening internationally at that time, even among, mobless comrades, in Britain and elsewhere. We had to struggle to be able to build effectively our own finances, our own method of training leaders and so forth. The reaction by the ANC in exile of the nationalists inside South Africa and elsewhere was to say, well, of course we support this, but not to raise a little finger, not one little finger, to give support to the movement that we had. And yet there was vast experience that could have been passed on. Instead of that, they said the only thing, and a kind of Blankism, is put us in power and we'll solve the problem. Anything which your workers do, if you raise wages, if you raise the concerns of housing and all the rest of it, that just proves that we need to come to power. They do not support working class. It's only workers internationally which will support workers, and we have to pioneer every form of direct links. Just the last point in relation to something that Finn has raised, and it's part of the discussion about, the rise of capitalist society, and economy out of slavery. What we see internationally, in the 70s and even now, are forms of racial capitalism. I've used that term advisedly because we don't want to put on labels to this particular regime or that particular regime without due cause. But in South Africa, we were fighting, which is still poorly understood, a form of racial capitalism, which was based on the combination of chieftainships, of corporate bodies, of police, of compounds, which is a military housing of workers and hostels, and of new forms of finance capital. I mean, that has been broken apart, but a new society has not been rebuilt. Out of the end of slavery, came indenturism, all kinds of it, throughout the Caribbean and elsewhere, with Indian workers were imported. As it turned out, most of those Indian workers were not rural workers. They were the people who were struggling for survival in Indian cities and were then, trying to get some other alternative, and then were indentured for 5, 7, 10 years, worked for virtually nothing apart from the food they had. And then, that has created a whole diaspora in South Africa and throughout the Caribbean and elsewhere. And out of that gave time for capitalism to reorganize itself after the end of slavery and to be able to turn labor into capital at an immense rate. So, the situation with the cheap labor system in South Africa and in Namibia, because it is one and the same system, was that some of the returns of to capital were not unexpectedly and not surprisingly 100% return on capital. Unbelievable returns, from the cheapening of labor at that time, which has led to the polarization of the working class and the unification of workers in mining and elsewhere, but the polarization politically of workers in all kinds of different nationalist directions. I was amazed to hear that the issue of scab labor between France and Britain led to the unification of workers. That's incredible at that time. Today, it's almost impossible. The idea of one nation's workers being pitted against the other produces the most extreme forms of nationalism, as we see in South Africa, with workers from Zimbabwe coming to South Africa and being beaten to death in the streets because they are challenging or they are seen as undermining, the gains that South African workers have made in South Africa. So we've seen this our answers, our approach has to be to break down that xenophobia, break down that nationalism, and show practically how we have an answer to the problems of society to get workers not to get into the cul-de-sacs, the dead ends of nationalism and all kinds of reaction, and to turn towards internationalism. But we have to have practical examples, and we have to work very strongly to be able to develop those so we can say, here, practically workers, this is what we can do. And we can see as in the workers in America and elsewhere are now unionizing and rising. In the same way, we will see this taking place in every country internationally.
Thank you, David. I can't see any other hands raised, so can I say a few words before you go, Ned?
Sure, yeah. Go for it.
Thank you. I quite agree that there are a number of issues in here which have been raised, and I quite agree with them. They need to be able to dialogue. They need to be able to learn from each other. They need to actually argue and come up to solutions, and obviously be able to take a step forward. But I think that is absolutely, I quite agree with them. That's where I saw Win as, to a large extent. And also it gives a room to be able to actually form links, which I think also is an important part of Win. There is one thing which I find is slightly different in terms of the issue of comparison with the First International. And that is the background. I don't dispute the areas in terms of what Marx and Engels did at the time, and the real hard, I think, endeavor, at least to say, that they actually undertook whenever anybody wanted to move out of the First International. The letters between Marx and Engels, in terms of anyone who wanted to say, oh, there is this possibility, and they thought this possibility may actually cause a split, and they fought everything they had, and they did try hardest not to, to ensure that no splits occur of any sort. But that is one part of, I think, of the whole thing. But there's a slight difference in terms of the background. When Marx and Engels started working, and even in the Communist League, to come up and identify, I think, socialism, in that case, communism, let's say, as not as an ideology, but literally as some way of differentiation of what they consider to be workers as a class in terms of communism with the other tendencies. They formulated that in the Communist Manifesto. What we have seen is, and they took it for granted, that there is already a movement, and they try to arm it. Recognition of the movement there, and the theory to arm it, and obviously organize it, and be able to actually go against the capital and the whole system of it. I think this is what they actually worked hardest at, and they managed to do this. What we're seeing is after, particularly after, I think, probably in the 20s in Soviet Union at the time, right up to now, a period of roughly about just under 100 years, there is a slight difference. A large sections of, if at the time Marx separated socialism from the other, or the socialism or communism as he saw it, different to other classes or what other social movements were pursuing, whether feudal or bourgeois or petty bourgeois, etc. What we have seen over this time period is a large number of other class movements who have actually taken up the issue or have fought under the banner, even with the hammer and sickle or under the name of socialism or Marxism, the actual ideas of other classes and other pursuits. Nationalism under the name of socialism, literally, or even communism for that matter, under the name of workers' communism. Or we've seen variety of other aspects formulating themselves on this path. And this was something different to the time of Marx in the First International, or Engels at the time of First International. Eurocommunism, as is known, China, Maoism, and variety of other ones all have come up and gone over this time. The question, which I think probably is different, is recognition of the movement that is there first. And that's what Marx and Engels actually had and taken for granted. And that's where they started from. They armed a movement that already existed. There seems to be a lot of assumption that that movement has died, and therefore we need to reintroduce it. I don't think that that movement has died. I think that movement has existed before Marx and is existing today and has never died. It hasn't had the ability to stand up against the others. It has been pushed away that I think today we see to a large extent, the word communism, unlike the time of the Marx and Engels, being associated with many other classes rather than that of the workers, which I think probably what makes more sense now to say worker communism rather than any other communism, if you know, in terms of the distinction. The same way that Marx and Engels separated communism from socialism to represent that movement. I think that's different today than it was then. The other issue, which I think probably is also important, is the understanding that while Marx and Engels tried their best internationally to grow as much of the mass movement, over these years, there have been changes, which I think probably needs to be debated. The question of building another international without ability of workers in one place to show their power somehow. That is one thing which I think is still debatable. During the time of Marx and Engels, that was not the issue. For example, one of the things that Lenin does say after the Third International, or formation of the Third International, is bluntly, not to quote word for word, but in context, it does mention that, look, we've gained power. We've shown that this can be done, and therefore they have effectively shown the practice of what they consider to be correct. So the question is, could an international be built without workers now, or a party or presence of workers in one place or the other? I'm not saying any place, having shown that gains could be achieved. So that might be, I think, a question of considering whether another international, in the same way that Marx and Engels formed it, could be done in this way today. I think there are changes and differences which need to be debated. Internationals could be built, but the question is by what forces, and that is an issue. At the time, any workers, and I think this was mentioned several times by everyone who contributed, it is based on organizations, individuals, or links with group of workers' representatives. I think that is absolutely crucial. There is no doubt about that. That's definitely there. But the way of building international, I think there are possibly changes compared to the way that Marx and Engels had to build it. Does this mean that we don't bring anybody with any idea and discuss? Absolutely not. Of course, that's correct. It's a forum, therefore it allows exchange and development, arguments, criticism. I don't think the criticism is only of self, but criticism of the others. All of this is part of win, which I think is very much true and is valuable. But the way of the international, I think sometimes when we mention, or are we in the time like Marx and Engels were at the time of the First International, there are differences, there are changes, which are material and it's outside, and that's because of a legacy of a variety of other issues which have been termed under the name of communism and Marxism, which are different to what it was at the time of Marx and Engels. So I think our path is a little bit more difficult in some senses, in terms of making that passage through. And also at the same time, a lot of lessons have been learned. One of the things which I think is probably an issue is, or could be considered is, for example, when we see struggles taking place in terms of working class alternatives and independence or new ways, I think new also means outside the framework of what it was before. New means anything new. Once it was cooperatives, once it was trade unions, there are a variety of other forms that could be formed. And I think that they are actually being formed in different places. So one is not the same answer as what we had before. Recognition of new things and new ways of workers actually forming and organizing is also on the table that could be discussed. That's it, thanks. I don't see any other hands. Does anybody else would like to?
Me. Can I come in?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Thanks.
Please do.
Thanks, comrade. I think to go back 10 years when we went through, well, 30 years now, when we went through a crisis in the International Committee of the Fourth International. We got a lot of inspiration from studying Marx's approach to the foundation of the First International, and it was a tremendous help conceptually in working out what we should do next. And I will repeat that I'm one of the very few surviving members of the Workers' International to rebuild the Fourth International, which says where we're at. We are for the building of international revolutionary leadership, and all the preparatory, and we're in favour of all the careful and preparatory steps that have to be done in the current situation to move towards that. You know, it's not all done in a phrase. Comrades have made some very important points. There's an extremely important point about the changes in industry around the world. It's a big point of debate whether the shift of industries to countries like Bangladesh and South America and the Pacific represent a real change in capitalism. And quite a few people around the Stalinist movement say that somehow this replaces Lenin's conception of imperialism, and that it's found a way to paralyze the possibility of solidarity between workers, say in Britain and in Bangladesh. I don't agree with this, but I think it does represent a very particular problem. How we develop a movement that links workers in these very different places, including China. The biggest part of the working class in the world is in China now. One of the reasons that the official trade union, global trade unions don't let China in is that they would be instantly outvoted the moment the Chinese trade unions are let into membership. So there are very definite and real problems linking up workers between different countries. And I think something we have to bear in mind is the possibility of international discussions for workers is an organizational question. Are they in organizations that can that can set up and run those discussions? Can they, in the unions that they're in, are they able to see to it that those unions have provide real genuine discussions between workers in different continents? So that's a point on discussion. But where we have been able to spend time talking about politics with workers, say in Namibia, what they raise is what happened to the previous attempts to do this. So they want to know what happened to the Second International. They want to know what happened to the Third International. They want to understand the degeneration of leadership. They're looking at us and thinking, is this a good bet to take on? The Second International degenerated, the Third International degenerated. How can we make sure that an international movement of workers doesn't degenerate? So it's an apparent return to 1864, 63, 64, but in reality, as well as that return and a return to that openness and having a wide discussion, there is the whole content of the intervening century. So, sorry, century and a half. Yeah. So it's a bit more complicated than that. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Paul. Ed, I think you probably better come in if maybe after the other comrades would like to come in, but I thought it might be a good idea to give you a chance to say something if you would like to, or would you rather wait?
Well, I mean, if there are other comrades who've got anything to say, I'm very happy to hear them. I don't see any hands up myself.
Nor do I.
Well, okay. I mean, I'll come back on some of those points. I mean, I think it's been so far a really very, very interesting and stimulating discussion, and I've learned a huge amount from listening to the comrades. I mean, can I just go back to some of the points that were raised earlier? I mean, Larry and other comrades raised this point about anarchism and the appeal of anarchism. And I think that, I mean, there's no doubt, certainly amongst some young people and young people who haven't necessarily had any big experience of being organized, that there is an appeal to anarchism because partly because of the discrediting of socialism by the experience of the rise of Stalinism, and young people looking around, obvious need for revolution, but lack of clarity about how that revolution can turn out to be more of a people's revolution and less of a revolution dominated by dictatorship and bureaucracy. And without study, without reading, without theory, a lot of that can lead to people drawing the conclusion that anarchism is the solution. That's in today's world, in today's young people, that is a factor. In the period of the 1930s, I mean, I think somebody raised, I think it might have been Finn, raised the question of anarchism had a big hold in Spain, France, and Italy. Why not? I would suggest perhaps the reason is that in comparison to Britain, which was by the 1930s, Britain was almost completely industrialized with a rural population that was very, very small. Whereas the working class in Italy, France, and Spain was recently, was of generations that had recently been agricultural workers, with the traditions of agricultural workers of, sort of some peasant traditions and so on, and seeing freedom and rebellion in a different sense from cohesion, solidarity, and workers' power. And that sort of that flavoring in the thinking of the labor movement would have given substance to the growth of anarchist organizations in those countries at that particular time. Comrades have mentioned about the need for a building of a new, fresh leadership. That it's about, this is David's contribution as well, about the way that strike breaking takes place today. I mean, at all stages in the movement, I would say this to David. I mean, even in Marx's time, getting international solidarity was not automatic. It was a question of work. It was one of the most fundamental reasons why the first international was created, and it's part of the movement today. I mean, there are general strikes taking place today. I mean, in the last few decades and so. I can't remember the year, but in Europe, within the EU, about 10 years ago, there was an all-European general strike called a one-day general strike. Very significant, not highly advertised in the capitalist press, but very, very significant. In the Caribbean, in Guadeloupe, which actually technically is part of France, there have been huge general strikes in the last 10 or 20 years. There've been general strikes that have gone on for several weeks as the island has been held up by strike action. So these movements are taking place there. Finn raised the point about the dependence of British capitalism on slavery, a very, very important point, which will lead, as more and more information comes to the surface, to more demands for compensation, quite justifiable demands for compensation. They'll lead to huge questions about the role of the British monarchy, about where the wealth of the British monarchy comes from. It'll lead to big universities and other big institutions in Britain being requested or asked or pushed to make recompense for capital that they've accumulated as a result of the slave trade. Many big estates, even estates that have now come into sort of quasi-public hands, like estates belonging to the National Trust, will, they'll have to ask questions about where the source of the wealth that they now own originally came from. And I think it's estimated that something like 15 million people were taken from West Africa to the Americas during the period of the slave trade. 15 million in those days was a huge chunk of the population. It was vast numbers of healthy, fit young people were taken away from their communities in West Africa. And the cultural and economic debilitation of those communities still exists today in places like Guadeloupe and the other countries of West Africa. The decimation of communities and the implications for their cultural and economic development. So, there will be, as these questions emerge more fully, there will be a lot of answers that need to be given. I I'm not sure if I understood everything that Aman was saying. Very interesting ideas, and perhaps, Aman, you need to do a session on some of that at some point in WIN to develop it more fully. Can we build without gains being achieved? I mean, this was probably a question that was being asked at the time of the First International as well. There are struggles, there are some gains, there are some defeats, and we have to build out of those gains and those defeats. And I completely agree with Aman that the legacy that we now inherit is a big difference. Just because this point is being made that the type of international we are trying to build at the moment is probably more akin to the First International, it doesn't mean that there is an exact parallel. I mean, for a start, the size of the working class in the world today is huge compared to what it was in Marx and Engels' time. The integration of the world economy and international trade is massive. And these are material factors that actually make the requirements for a workers' international far more vivid, far more clear today than it was in those days. Plus the fact, of course, as other comrades have pointed out, that communication in today's world is so much more instantaneous. We don't have to write letters and hope that they arrive and wait long times for replies and so on. You can have a conversation on the other side of the world within a day. There are huge opportunities to build, and once something gets going, once there is a noticeable movement, I think it'll take off very, very quickly. I think that the difficult thing is getting things started. like Bob pointed out, China is undoubtedly the biggest working class in the world. And in fact, many of the main factors still allowing the capitalist economies of the West to hang on and continue operating derive from the role of China in the world economy. And yet our access to the Chinese working class to have common organization with them is very, very limited. Once we start getting a breakthrough there, I think things could become very different and things could move very, very quickly. Yeah, there's a whole century and a half that has changed the situation from the time of the First International. And we're not trying to do exactly the same thing, but we're trying to learn many of the lessons of the way Marx and Engels organized and attempted to organize and worked with others and listened to others and engaged in debate with all kinds of different trends and currents. We're trying to reconnect with those methods and break away from the methods of those little fringe groups now who insist that they are right and that the masses will come rallying to them as soon as they notice that this tiny little group of sectarians has got the perfect program. Those groups are really, it's sad because many of them were once our friends and some of them still even are. And they are going nowhere, but hoping to be leaders of the world revolution. And I think the work we're trying to do is, to learn from the way that Marx and Engels operated a century and a half ago, to try and develop something more appropriate to the aims, the immediate aims that the movement must have in the present period.
Thank you, Ed. Would any other comrade would like to come in? Oh, I can definitely say it was it. Yes, sure.
Just some points. You see, I want to go back to this this point in relation to huge movements taking place, and then the development of Marxist forces. Let's say, no, let's not even use that term. Let's just say authentic organizations of struggle arising. Let's think in terms of the language of the First International. And we see, I'm just speaking from the South African experience. We see all kinds of small organizations developing, very closely linked to struggle, police going and assassinating some of those people, but also under assault from different political groups, which see their job is to make money from the state, and these people are standing in the way. So we see a kind of civil war emerging among poor people, actually, or people who some people are struggling to use politics as a way to enrich themselves, and others who are just struggling to live at all in the city. I'm thinking particularly of my city in Durban. Now, you would imagine there is enormous struggles taking place, but hardly any progress. It seems, I wouldn't say it's a war of all against all, it's not. It's actually quite carefully, well, let's say not carefully calibrated. It's quite distinct groups in struggle against each other, but some really major problems. For instance, truckers, all the transport in between Johannesburg and Durban, the two major poles of economy of South Africa, being paralyzed by a strike against foreigners, against foreign truckers being brought in. Now, this paralyzes unions because those unions are struggling to develop regional solidarity, class ideas, and so forth, And we are involved in a very sharp struggle. Now, I'm not saying this is typical of everything elsewhere, but in Sri Lanka, you know, we can see, you know, their developments. We've seen enormous struggles taking place of literally millions. But then, you know, how are we intervening there and then building? Or is it a matter of things turning out okay in the end? I'm not too sure. We could become, as Ed is, you know, is somewhat, you know, presented, that we'd be a small group with nice ideas, and maybe in the end people will just come to us. We're not that. But at the same time, we're not yet an effective solidarity group, which is bringing to bear the resources that we have at the point of struggle, although we are advancing in different ways. You know, if we go back to the question of the anti-apartheid movement, which is one of the great movements of the world in comparison somewhat to that of slavery, we've had a huge development of solidarity, but the outcome has not been terribly good. And, you know, we've got rid of apartheid, but we've got capitalism, at least in the minds of our leaders, entrenched and defending that vigorously. And at the same time, we found the workers actually not right. Many of them are tied up, you know, with the politics of collaboration and extreme nationalism and xenophobia and all the rest of it. So in other words, we are involved in a very active political struggle in which we see huge turmoil, huge opportunities, but also some quite palpable threats even to our existence. For instance, if I were to say what I'm saying now at a meeting of people in Durban, you know, my life would be threatened. Murderers are people I know who've murdered workers, you know, are now employers in the docks. You know, you know, people are, how do I put it? We're looking for points of strength. We're looking for points of theoretical and political clarity to find our way through a very murky situation at times. It's marvelous to see the struggles emerging in Peru and Colombia. In every part of the world, we see here in Maryland, workers are, you know, becoming unionized. But the political ideas are absolutely critical. And we have to learn the lessons of every struggle and to be able to pass those on. And that's where we, well, I'm saying that's where we need to return to maybe what some traditional ideas which we've used, or methods that we've used in the past, in a very open-ended manner, to be able to gather around those ideas, the forces that are going to provide the leadership into the future.
Thank you, Dave. Roger and Larry have their hands up. I'm sorry, I didn't notice which one of you went up, or maybe at the same time.
Probably Larry was first, yeah.
Okay, Larry, would you like to go on there?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks, Roger, for conceding. The point, just briefly on a couple of points that were mentioned, David and Ed were mentioning the elements of small groups hoping to lead the working class. You know, the working class are going to fall into their hands, so to speak. And I think that that's the lessons I've learned since being a trade unionist and political activist, is that I've always been prepared to be, I've always taken an issue of non-alignment, but work in collaboration with different people. And I know Bob from the past, you know, we're working with people like Dot and Pete Gibson and Ted Knight, people like that, at grassroots on a how can I say, a class struggle level. And I find that people like the Labour Coordinating, LRC, the Labour Left Alliance as it stands now, they want to lead the working class, but my opinion, they stand separate from them. Similar to workers' power and certainly the SWP at the moment are standing different. They're separate. They seem to be concentrating on building a party as opposed to influencing the working class. They influence the working class through their papers and other things. But when I've tried to initiate a network of shop steward directories, it doesn't get any traction because it doesn't lead to membership of a particular party. Whereas the Workers' International Network is different, in my opinion. It's trying to build networks of workers at different levels to bring about the influence of class struggle as opposed to a class party. And that's all I want to say on that, man. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry.
Oh no, I will just want to add one note that I just put in the column there. And when we first came into contact with each other was through the print worker support groups. And it wasn't about just winning or trying to win the dispute. Same as the NUM, you know, I learned lessons from the NUM support workers groups. It was about influencing and building solidarity, not just for the dispute, but on a class basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. Roger, please go ahead.
Okay, well, I think it's the mark of a really stimulating and really effective discussion is that it never stops, that more and more questions are raised, and we want to keep coming back. And it's tempting to just take up every point and start again. And I promise you, I'll try to resist that temptation, except for. But I just wanted to say, first of all, that we always tend to put the positive side, to stress the positive, and to emphasize how what the potential is in the situation for socialist revolution. But that doesn't mean that we're blind to the effects of and to the danger of defeats and of the horrific consequences that could come from those defeats. And you know, it's right to stress the possibilities that are inherent, because but at the same time, you know, there is no, for all the reasons we've discussed, there is no international, there is no actual expression of the latent solidarity that exists within the working class. That's largely due to the destruction of the old working class and the fact that we more or less have a virgin proletariat now, whether you take it from the new industrial proletariat in China and other countries where the working class never had any big foothold before, and also the fact that the old industrial unions have been smashed in Britain especially, and in Europe, and certainly in North America, and so on. And therefore, we're rebuilding from the very beginning. But nevertheless, the contradictions of capitalism are such that they cannot prevent struggles continually breaking out again and again and again. And we're seeing that, particularly in Britain now. For how long it is, you know, it's 50 years since we had the, or anyway, 40 years since we had the big industrial battles, ending really with the struggle that Larry and Amanda mentioned, the print workers, and more or less simultaneously the miners' strike. And they were the last really big struggles that we had until the recent period. But I think a whole new era of trade union struggle is opening up now. David mentioned about the public sector workers. I mean, the trade unions in Britain are more or less, hardly an exaggeration, it's a slight exaggeration to say that they are confined to the public sector now. And that's a shrinking public sector because of the constant move towards privatizations and so on. But nevertheless, it's a force of millions of workers. And we saw yesterday what a huge potential power that they might have. But having said all that, if these struggles, which are coming, which can't be prevented. But if they are defeated, decisively defeated, if they're crushed, then of course we'll see all kinds of horrors rising to the surface. So I think what David has quite understandably and quite rightly is reminding us of those dangers with his references to South Africa. But let's remember that South Africa, I hope he'd agree with me, I don't know, but it seems to me it's a particular case because of the mass demoralization. They were ahead of the rest of us. They went through a revolution. They went through a huge, massive, heroic uprising against the most horrific odds. And what do we see now? Millions and millions and millions of youth unemployed. Corruption on an astronomical scale. Defeat after defeat, demoralization after demoralization. And as a result, that's where I think the xenophobia comes from. A complete, outbreak of mass despair and a complete desperation as to where they can go next. And that is the fate that we will all face. That's the fate that we'll face in Britain too if our struggles are defeated. But I think South Africa is in a slightly different point in the time scale, if you like, than the rest of us. South Africa, and of course there are many other countries too, which are faced with the same defeats and the psychological effects of them. I'd just say, well, there are other points that I would have liked to mention, but I would just say finally, I can't remember which comrade said, well, what happened to the second and third internationals and so on. And that, of course, is very much the same kind of issues involved. But we are going to be discussing that. This discussion we had today is the first in a series, an occasional series, if you like, on the history of the internationals. But I would say perhaps one thing which marks us out so much from the other left groups is that they all talk about, building the fourth international. And of course, that's, and one of them, in fact, even talks about building the fifth international, having sort of not quite noticed, perhaps, that the fourth international never did become a mass force. But nevertheless, I mean, the call for a fourth international, which was made by Trotsky in the 1930s, had a resonance because there were millions and millions and millions of workers who were organized in either the second international or the third international. And so when he raised the call for a fourth international, it meant something. It meant that your internationals have failed. We need to create a new one. We need to create the new one, which is based on all the best traditions of the Socialist International and the Communist International. But today, to say, well, we need a fourth international, it's talking complete gibberish. People would not know what on earth you are talking about. You're talking in a different language. So what we say now is that we need to build a worldwide movement of the working class. That's how we put it. And that's really what the this series is all about. I won't say any more. I'll leave other points, but we will obviously, just so the point is that this discussion throws up so many issues that it's given us a lot more ideas about what needs to be on the program of discussions of WIN meetings in the next few weeks.
Thank you, Roger. Any other contributions? If none, can I just ask?
Just a minute, just a very quick point. I'm not putting a perspective of South Africa that we're in a period of reaction, but we are in a sharp competition between reaction and the rising forces, which are quite weak if you look at them numerically, but very strong in terms of the traditions which we've espoused for the past 50 years. And that's where people will be looking for to return and to bring in fresh layers, because 12 million unemployed, educated youth is a very powerful revolutionary factor if it's brought in the right direction. And we've got to clarify exactly why we've ended in this cul-de-sac. It's a dead end of note, and how we arise out of the situation. And that's where we're looking to, I think, it's not we as South Africans, but we all are looking to developing in the new international forces, which are represented by the idea and the reality of the first international. Open discussion, and then practical solidarity and collective action.
Thank you, David. Okay, just before we close, oh, sorry, Ed, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I wanted to say a few words, winding up the political side of the discussion. I mean, a lot of it has already been said, but I mean, you know, the movement goes in waves, and like the waves of the sea, you know, there are big swells and underlying currents, but there are also little waves and fluctuations within them, you know, and you know, it's right that the South African working class were ahead of the game. I mean, about I can't remember the year, but about 20 years ago, I was just so excited because the young people of South Africa were rising to their feet, and we'd had such a long period of no young people anywhere in the world visibly making a making a protest, making an attempt at revolution. And you know, in some ways, the Corbyn movement in Britain was similar. You know, and you know, the movement in Greece in 2015 as well, you know, it raised hopes, and you know, the eyes of the world were focused. Every socialist, every militant worker in the world was focused on Greece. Would this be the breakthrough? Would this be the David that slung a successful stone at Goliath and brought down the EU, and you know, subverted the kind of huge domination by European central banks, by the World Bank and so on, of politics all over the world? And each one of these struggles seems to be beaten down, and we go back seemingly in the news, in the capitalist media, we go back to where we were before, but we don't really go back to where we were before. It's every accumulation of experience of a new generation of people in struggle prepares the ground for a more profound, more thought out struggle. And it's with this greater profoundness and greater determination to find a way forward that, I mean, that's part of the task of building the kind of international that we're talking about. But it's also a way of finding the road. I mean, we've had, really since about 1945, we've had 3 generations, certainly in the Western world, who've grown up in an atmosphere of reformism, that, you know, you vote for parliament, you get a candidate who will do something for you, society will gradually get better somehow, and you know, we don't, and that's changing. People are beginning to understand that it's going to take a different kind of movement, a mass movement, a movement from below, a movement from the underground, a movement of the most apolitical and oppressed, who've never thought they can be involved before. It's going to take that to subvert all the shine on the top of society that sort of pretends it knows what it's doing and so on. And it's through that we will find a way forward to create a deeper, more powerful movement that will lead to the kind of international that we're talking about.
Thank you. Just to probably mention something, I think sometimes a lot of us think about staircases as going up. What sometimes is better to think about sometimes is spiral staircases. If you look at it across the 2 dimensions, it looks as if you're always in the same place. But when you think about it, you're effectively going one step higher with a lot more experience. I think when we look at the time when the Berlin Wall fell down and the end of socialism was called, if you remember, crisis of Marxism was shouted, right wing is the answer, market wins. We all knew that's short-lived, and I think today we've seen the outcome. There are lots of new points, lots of issues to come, and I think that this series on international is really, really fruitful, and I think it would be one of those topics that I think many of us would look forward in the next sessions to see who's going to represent the number 2, part 2. I don't know whether that would be Ed or one of the other comrades, unless Roger would, or any one of you would like to comment with regard to the next session, then I say goodbye here. Roger, would you want to add anything about the next session?
Yes, next week we're discussing Britain at a very apposite time. After the huge demonstration yesterday, the beginning of the one of the biggest strikes for decades in Britain, with the rail strike, and possibly communication workers strike coming soon too. We hope to have a speaker from the RNT, the rail union, and I'm also going to be giving a short intro on the general background.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, with that, let's call the end of the meeting, and thanks very much, everybody. Thanks again. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, comrades.